I'm Tom Finnigan, and today I'm joined as usual by my Murphin co-host and chair of the Australian Cyber Network, Jason Murrell. Today we're going to unpack the just released State of the Industry 2024 report. It's the most comprehensive snapshot of Australia's cyber sector to date. Now, Jason, you've been deep in the data, so where do we begin with all this information?
Tommy, always great to be here, and this is us Murphining into the ACN report. So I'll just have to keep switching sort of hats in between each part just to sort of talk about this part. But this fits in with the work that we do all the time and everything we talk about here. So obviously everything we do with Murphin is to raise the profile of businesses in the cyber sector. And I think the good thing about this report is obviously it's bringing together over 30 data sets that give us a clear sort of line of sight into the industry, where it's thriving, where it's sort of vulnerable, and I suppose what needs to be done next. These are the key things I think that we need to look at as an industry, and we need some sort of baseline report. This has been pegged against the 2030 strategy and other stuff that's come out from government. So it'll give us a good sort of guidepost and a sort of, I suppose, almost like when you go to school and having your school report done on a yearly basis to really show us where we're sitting and where there could be room for improvement and where we're actually doing really well.
Yeah, and look, where we first met at Cyber, there was a sector competitiveness report. It was a good effort, but it didn't hit the mark. And so it's amazing to see the Australian Cyber Network actually dive in and create this incredibly rich report for industry, for government. There is so much great stuff in there. So let's start with the stat that's got everyone talking. 69% of Australian businesses that you surveyed have experienced a ransom attack last year, and 84% of them paid. I mean, that's staggering. And also with the changes in legislation last year, I'm sure a bunch of them would have fallen into this new mandatory reporting category.
Yeah, so that report done by McGrath-Nicol was done with over 500 businesses and, with 50 employees or more. That's on the ground sort of stat that they've got with YouGov, basically showing that 69% of the businesses they surveyed had experienced a ransomware attack last year, and 84% of them paid, which I found staggering. Obviously, the government says that they would prefer that, or their line is that don't pay the ransom. But, once a person or a business is in that situation, it's different. And we've spoken about this on this program before about you can go through, tabletop exercise as much as you like. But once the reality of the situation hits, it's amazing how you have to sort of pivot, and in these incidents, often companies like McGrath-Nicol, legal people and all those sorts of things get called in, and they negotiate a lot of the times with these gangs because these gangs basically that's their business model is to go and do this. So the average ransom paid in that report was 1.35 million. So that's up from 103 million the year before. And so they're not stats, right? They're real world figures and impacts. People's jobs, their savings, retirement funds. We saw with the superannuation hack recently, that was just a multi-factor authentication thing being missed, right? And there's breaches happening all the time. There's ransomware incidents happening all the time, and you need to have a really clear post on where that sort of sits.
And it's such a wicked problem. I mean, to be a business owner and to be faced with that decision of literally, I've been locked out of all of my stuff. What do I do? How do I get the business kind of get up and going again? And unfortunately, as we know, when you do pay ransom, you're kind of ignoring the fact that there's probably been a whole bunch of data, some personal identified data that's been exfiltrated. Anyway, Jason, how do we square that up with the ASD stat that only 11% of reported incidents were ransomware? It's a bit of kind of difference there.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Obviously, the difference is that what's actually reported. So most ransomware incidents go unreported, especially among SMEs. But obviously with the new legislation that was passed in November last year, it now requires businesses with turnover of above 3 million to report ransomware payments within 72 hours. So obviously next year's figures should be a lot clearer and likely probably even more alarming, but if it happens to a small business, and we hear it all the time, and I get calls like you do all the time, from businesses that are in that situation, and they basically sort of talk to you about paying it. And this happens just in the general populace as well. I get incidents and calls all the time of people who have been popped, with just their bank accounts, small businesses. I hear this all the time, local hairdresser or just a small local business that gets hit for a small ransom amount. They'll rather pay that to get themselves back online as quickly as possible rather than have the imposter business. But they're not calling anyone to let them know that. That's where that sort of issue is with regard to the numbers. And I don't think we could ever solve it to say we'll get 100% picture of it. we can only work with the data that we've got, and that's what we're basically doing here. So as many data sets as we can get, we're using the cross-reference, but obviously we always call out the industry and say, if there is more data, if it's more in depth, then we're happy to take it. But, we're just working with the data that we've got currently. And this report, this is our first year, right? We're a small team. We'll look to grow this year on year, and we're a not-for-profit, so if we can get more support from others in the industry to sort of help us. We've had, you'll see in the report, some great reports there from local cyber companies and members there that sort of really help flesh out the report. But, rather than sitting on the sidelines and people, taking pot shots at what we could do better, come roll up the sleeves and come and help us. We really want this report to be as in-depth as possible and as accurate as possible. And we can only just basically take and draw on the information that we have available.
I think that's a fantastic point. We need a Team Australia, we need a Team Cyber, and, we do see some loud critics out there that are picking at, specific bits of these reports. I mean, jump on board, like, the power of working this together. And look, just another little thing too, the simple things you often talk about. You're on the radio in Perth yesterday, 2FA. Personally, I had a ping this morning at 7 a.m. from my internet provider, and it was a 2FA code. And so I jumped on, and I think it was credential stuffing, but basically they didn't get all the way through because I had 2FA switched on. I spoke to them and we're all sorted out. The passwords changed. But, it is just a constant problem. And if you're not set up, you're in real trouble. So let's shift over now to the cyber workforce and really dive into the talent and diversity there. So we've got this growing threat. How is the workforce holding up to it?
We're obviously growing, but still under-resourced, right? So the cyber workforce grew by just a tick under 10%. So I think it was 137,000 people. So that's encouraging, but obviously, demand is outpacing supply, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a crazy problem there. And I think a lot of these kind of workforce education pathways and transitions from other roles into cyber, they really need to be kind of worked on. One of the things that, we see in a lot of places we go is the diversity challenge. There's a lot of women in cyber law roles. There's a lot of women in cyber education. But, at the end of the day, when you do walk the floor in a big cyber conference, you're seeing a lot of men in those technical roles. But one of the things that you've done is pulled up a bit of a data change and some signs of improvement. So let's dive into that a bit more.
Yeah, look, female participation jumped from, 17% in 2021 up to 25% in last year's numbers, 2024. So that's an 8% increase. So that's a huge leap in a lot of aspects, but and it reflects obviously the work done and targeted by organisations like the Australian Women's Security Network and the like. But we've still got a way to go, especially in technical roles. We also saw that First Nations enrolment in cyber degrees is increasing slowly, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be. These are areas that we've been pushing for a while, and as you said, Tom, and we've spoken about on the program a lot. There are certain roles, like there's more female cyber lawyers than there are male, in that, sort of awareness and education space, especially in the larger organisations, there is a high female participation rate. But in those technical roles, we need to make that pathway a bit clearer and a bit more inclusive, I think, in there. And, we have on the board for the Australian Cyber Network, Jack Rees, from Batum, who does a power of work in the area with regard to Indigenous scholarships and the like. And he's, I think they give half of their profits, back into communities. So, he's doing a lot of work, but we need a lot more. We've got Supply Nation, other things for Indigenous people, but, we really do need to try and help push that across the board. So that is something the report shows, and it'd be good to have that as a guidepost and see how we go, and actually putting the focus on that will hopefully bring more people forward.
I remember speaking to Jack about some of the terrible problems that you can have out in the very remote parts of Australia in some of these towns where everything is done off your phone. And so if you have a problem with signal connection, you've got a problem accessing healthcare, you've got a problem accessing food and all these kind of services, emergency services. So it literally becomes your lifeline. Such an important piece of work that they're doing there.
And that top end, as Tom, we know, like, remember when we were doing, like, with our cyber, that northern node, that sort of area all the way through Northern Territory, North Queensland, up into Arnhem Land and the like, and the Tiwis and across northern WA and all through WA. High Indigenous populations, very spread and diverse, a lot of prepaid phones, and a lot of access points for people to go and actually take money from them, because of this remoteness. So, to get that message spread again, we talk always about the Team Australia approach, and that's an area where we really need to fixate and focus to fix, and vulnerable people just more generally. That's something, obviously, when we set up the Australian Cyber Network, was to protect small businesses, the vulnerable communities, people that often get overlooked in a lot of these pieces of work.
Yeah, it's such important stuff. All right. So let's switch over now to education and skills readiness. You've done some data on degrees. How's the education pipeline looking at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think this is a tricky one, and this, again, the whole point of this report is to bring up some stuff which is probably a bit uncomfortable to talk about, and actually causes a bit of obviously a bit of discussion in the industry. But the enrolments in security science degrees have surged 186% since 2019. But the big thing is that, and as Matt Wilcox from Fifth Domain points out in his article, enrolments aren't the same as readiness. We don't test for capability like we do in other sectors. You wouldn't trust a pilot who'd never flown, at least in a sim, right?
Yeah.
Yet in cyber, that's often what we do. We need real life, live fire training and skills mapping, and not just certifications. So, like that's something, again, we talk about all the time on here, and there's multiple things, and we've got Matt coming up in a pod as well. These are the things that we talk about all the time, is to get skills ready. And that's for businesses as well. We talk about real life drills. So there's programs in Australia like, Cyber Wardens, which is, looking to fill that gap. We need to have people that have got, like, you go through a fire drill, we need that actually happening in businesses, and SMEs are often the ones that are sort of overlooked in that.
Yeah, so look, it's more than just bums on seats. We just literally need boots on that digital ground, and we need more of them. All
Yep.
right, so let's swing over to investment, startups, and very importantly, sovereign capability. So, what about the business side of the sector? Where and how are we seeing growth?
Yeah, look, revenue from cybersecurity companies hit 6.13 billion in 2024. So startups raised 348 million. It showed in the report, which is more than triple a year before, and that's massive, obviously. But again, none of that money actually came from Australia. We are not sponsoring or supporting our businesses locally. Most of the people are having to look offshore to go and get that capital to come into their businesses.
Yeah, it's a bit rough, that. And look, 97% of those companies are Australian owned. So there's some good news there, I guess.
Yeah, look, and as we've spoken about, mate, this is us talking amongst ourselves, but obviously when we're talking out to the community, as we often do, and this is something that we have conversations with our cybers all the time. The ecosystem is very fragile here, right? And as Kirsten McIntosh said in her feature, our founders don't want handouts; they want a fair shot.
Yeah, 100%.
If we buy local and we back talent early, we get our first, sort of cyber unicorn sooner rather than later. This is the thing, is that often our startups, and we talk about this all the time, have to go offshore to go and earn their stripes, or go and get their money. We're going to be, again, in a podcast coming up, talking to, Casey Ellis from Bugcrowd. Bugcrowd raised 100 mil last year. They're $1 billion company, so they are a unicorn, but they've had to really go and domicile themselves off in the US to become successful. And then they get taken seriously. And this happens all the time with our startups. They go offshore, they set themselves up over there, and we lose all these good quality talent. But we need, especially government and larger corporates, to back our startups and actually start buying local. Because then when you go offshore, Tom, like, we're going to RSA in a week's time. When you go to RSA, what will happen is the first question they would ask you if you're a startup going there, who's your customer in Australia? Now, if you can say that it's a government, either state or federal, or a large corporate that someone might recognise, at least when they go look it up, notice that they're in the top 200 on the ASX at least, or top 50 even better, they're going to give you more of a chance, right? But this is something that we don't see, and we have to go, okay, we've tried here, we've slogged away, can't get a break, we're going to head offshore.
Australia, traditionally, it's all down the East Coast, but you've done a state-by-state breakdown with this. So what about state-level capacity? What stood out to you in the report?
Yeah, we mentioned earlier, we spoke to, 6PR, and we often have chats with them, and they're very open. It's good that Ollie Peterson, Mark Dora, and always get us on there to talk about it to the audience, right, to try and get it through. But, WA is a good case study because they contributed around $500 million at GBA, but only 17 local cyber companies were identified in the report. So of the 302, it's only 17 over there, right? So it is very, as you say, very East Coast centric, and we need to lift capability nationally and not just on the East Coast. And I think there's a lot of work being done by, groups over in WA. It's a great community. When we did our launch last year, there's so much happening there. And when you think the amount of money that's coming through from mining and other aspects there, it should be, doing a lot better. They've got a great system with the Edith Cowan University and others that bringing really quality individuals into the market. and having them ready to start work straight away. But that's low. And WA has a lot of smart people over there, and a lot of people with solutions. I know from Red Piranha, that they again had to go offshore. They weren't getting local backed, from WA Gov or any others, so they're having to go offshore to go and get some support. And we need to really break that down. It goes back to what we're just speaking about: is we need to back our startups, and especially local. And they're very parochial over in WA. So they really should be giving their local businesses a go.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's shift into the policy strategy and accountability section of the report. Now, one of the reasons you and I started Murphin Group, the ACN, was really to kind of add to the work of the cybersecurity strategy. There's been a lot of chatter about the government strategy, the phases. Whereabouts are we at with it? And is it really making the difference at the scale that we need?
Look, I reckon, and again, we spoke about this before, the cybersecurity strategy, the 2030 strategy is solid, right? It's got everything laid out the way it should be. And we're behind the delivery, and we're talking about that all the time ourselves, both from a Murphin point of view and the ACN. The Executive Cyber Council, which was supposed to lead industry input, has only released one public update since it launched. And that's not good enough. We need to know where we're sitting with this. And it's very top heavy as well. So it's got a lot of, the larger corporates or the big end of town. But we've just talked about startups and people who are on the front line. Where are they within that group to really help out? It seems to be more government lobby, sort of higher end sort of companies, and it's missing. If we look at when we're doing the stuff with the Dynamic Standards International and the S&B 1001, that's looking after SMBs. That's 98% of the businesses here in Australia are 20 employees or less, right? So we need to get more of a voice from that aspect there, and that's what we've been trying to sort of push here in the report, and actually make stuff easier to find and publicly available. I was sitting on a panel with Catherine Rowe, the QBE CISO the other week, and before we were talking about the report with Kylie Watson, another one of our board members from DXC, and she went on a search. She said she was using chat and all these different things to try and find where's the detail on this report, or the delivery mechanisms and all that sort of stuff. And when I asked for a show of hands in a room full of 150 CISOs, I said, who's actually read the strategy and the support papers that go with it on the delivery mechanisms, everything? Maybe 10% of people put their hand up in the room. So this is the other thing, is that if we're all going to get on board with this, we all should really be implementing and looking at what's in the strategy. And that was, when I looked for a show of hands and put the hand up, it was very low. And that was, for me, quite concerning as well.
I've seen some criticism of some of the data in the ACN report online, but the point is that it's transparent, it's open. You can actually get in there. You can take your time to read the report before you throw a comment in, and all of the working out is at the back. And the new ANSCO codes, it's all kind of fantastic. But one of the challenges is Home Affairs and the military owning the strategy. It does lead to an element of, I'd say, a lack of transparency because of the environment that they work in. They are in a secret environment. So, transparency is an issue with this strategy. So what exactly do you think we need to see to lift that transparency and to allow people to kind of understand and get on board in a much bigger way?
Yeah, well, we can't obviously secure our nation behind closed doors. We need public benchmarks. We need open engagement. We need clear funding transparency. Otherwise, this strategy risks being just all talk and no teeth, right? And no action. We have to have something where we can say, okay, that funding was given to that company to do this work, or that group. What was the outcome of that? And actually have some clear metrics that we can see. And also be open to, actually, when you get given funding, bring as many people in as you can on that journey, right? It seems to be often with these grants and these proposals that a certain group or a group of people win it, and then it's to the exclusion of everyone else. So if you were a losing bidder, if I was government, I'd be more inclined to go, hey, these guys missed out, but only just. They're actually really good. Get them involved as well. Like bring the groups together and actually just work more collaboratively. Because just because you won the grant and this person over here didn't, or these people didn't, it doesn't mean that their idea wasn't great. And I just think that if we work more collaboratively that way, have more ideas at the table, and less people that have a vested interest in the outcome as well. There's some pieces of work there where people are sort of almost setting up their own nest off the back of the grant. They're going to go and get more money or do whatever the case may be. I think we need to have more people working that are looking for the betterment of the greater good of all, rather than just the select few, which tends to happen way too often in the industry here in Australia.
On a personal note, it's been a bit disappointing for me to see some of these awareness campaigns go out to agencies that have relationships back to government staffers and stuff like that, whereas they should have gone to the people that are best able to actually get this message out there. And I think there's been, a lack of impact around some of this messaging and storytelling. And ultimately, something that's so important to me, and I know you, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if the
Mm.
culture is not being set, well, the strategy is going to just not work. So let's just dive into the final part now and the way forward. So, what are your final thoughts, and what's the call to action for everyone out there who's listening?
What's our again the stuff we always talk about, and it was mentioned on radio yesterday, and in a lot of the stuff we do is password managers. I mean, passphrases, whatever people want, but password managers is going to be the simplest way to solve this, right? MFA, as you mentioned in this talk as well, multi-factor authentication, second layer protection, and the backups. Like if we're looking at it and we use that car analogy, I think which works really well. And when I've done it, speaking off stage to people, is your password's like a seatbelt in the vehicle. The multi-factor authentication is like your airbags, that extra layer of protection just in case for whatever reason that fails or you get hit from the side as a seatbelt. And then, your updates when available is like servicing your vehicle, make sure the brakes work and all that sort of stuff. Tying this back to analogies or what means something else to get into the public, and just sort of break through or out of that bubble that we talk about. So we'll do this podcast and this will stay within our sector. And unfortunately, we don't tend to be able to push too far past that. We're trying, obviously, as best we can, but for the public, we need them to be part of the solution. Cybersecurity isn't just a tech issue, right? As Michelle McGuinness often talks about, it's a kitchen table issue, right? That affects everything from the cost of living and trust in government. It's as quick as a cyber attack, which is going to basically wipe out a business. What was it? The average figure for business was $50,000 for a small business that gets hit, and for an individual, $30,000. That was in the ASD report. And if we're looking at that ASD report, there was a report every 8 minutes up to 6 minutes. So these things are reflected in the report as well, and they're going in the wrong direction. And we really need to basically start tapping into that a lot quicker. And the numbers don't lie as a sector. I know we're in this government cycle at the moment of an election without even talking about cyber, but cyber contributed almost $10 billion in GBA to Australia. As we said before, it's employing, almost 140,000 people as a workforce, which is up almost 10% from last year. The cyber revenue hit 6.13 billion, again, up nearly 10%. And then the investment was a measly, sort of 348 million, but that tripled from the year before. But that's a vote of confidence in Aussie talent, but didn't come from government. And as we said, ransomware's up. Australia now ranks 4th globally in cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. We're a real sitting duck at the moment, and we just need to basically get these real basic things in place to actually make a difference and sort of turn the tide. And until we sort of talk about it and put it out in the public domain, I don't really see it moving that much because, these figures will circulate within our industry. We really need main publications to pick this stuff up and really start pushing the messaging through, because that's the only way we're going to move it. Talking amongst ourselves and, we're trying to get outside that bubble. You and I, Tommy, with the stuff we do and with ACN, really trying to make a stage and create a platform for businesses and people here. It's a hard slog when you don't get much in the way of backing. I think as an industry, we really need to be backed in more, because it is it's a critical threat. And probably when we talk about critical infrastructure and like, if something gets taken out in Australia, being as widespread as we are, we have a lot of critical infrastructure sitting out in the middle of nowhere that is, again, prime target. These criminals are going for the lowest hanging fruit. And if we don't, start to bolster this stuff up, post haste, we're going to be in a real world of pain.
Yeah, and as you said, it's getting worse. And what is it going to take to really shock people? And I think, working in TV news for a long time, one of the things was I attended a lot of fatal car accidents. And when we see it on the news and you've got no relationship to it, it's a bad story. When you see it on the news and through a friend that someone might be involved, it's quite shocking. When you personally know someone who's been involved in that accident, your world can change.
Yeah.
And so you need to take this seriously. When we walk into a workplace with the job we've got, we expect that the organisation is taking care of fire safety, that they'll have drills, that they've got OH&S, that spills will be cleaned up, that there's insurance to cover me and things there if I slip and hurt myself. We're just not there with cyber yet. So it's a really important journey we're on. So look, Jason, thanks for joining me. Thanks for having this chat, and thanks for all the work you've done at the ACN with Linda and the team. So, listeners, you can download the full report at stateoftheindustry.ausscybernetwork. Jump on. The link will be in the show notes. It's an important conversation. Please get involved. Please reach out. We'd really love to build our Team Cyber Australia and help reset this culture from the top down and the bottom up.
Thanks, Tony. Good work.